This lecture is going to be on focused primarily and exclusively on Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian era. That obviously is the time period of his presidency, which he runs in 1824, is not elected, runs again in 1828, is elected for a second term. So obviously the Jacksonian era is the era of his presidency, but that term is also used accurately and inaccurately to describe the time period in general. And that is because this is a time period that is marked by the expansion of the franchise. That is to say, the more people are allowed to vote. Namely, property requirements are removed from the ability to vote. So now suddenly someone who does not have property can vote. We're always, since the founding, it had been, free white men of property. So that property requirement is taken away. Obviously, enslaved Black Americans, women, free Blacks, Native Americans cannot vote. But this is seen as a huge expansion of democracy for white men, at least. And that is this Jacksonian era. When people refer to the Jacksonian era, they often mean that. Hence the meme here that white workers... the rights of white workers expand from the early republicanism of Jefferson to the anti-federalism of, Jefferson when he becomes president, Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy. The key distinction here in the era of Jackson is poor whites in the Jeffersonian period. If we're referring to poor whites, we probably mean farmers. Poor white tenant farmers or people who rent land, who cannot own land. Where as we move into the 1830s, we have increasing industry and we have a poor white working class. So people working in nascent industries, really a lot of them in the North. So although Jackson is a Southerner and a Westerner, and we associate him with Tennessee and South Carolina and Kentucky and the Battle of New Orleans, this is a time period where a lot of Northern white ethnics or white working class would have been voting for Jackson, for the Democratic Party, because that was the party that was giving them more rights. The Whigs didn't offer them anything. The Whigs were a party of the elite. It was about tariffs and gold standard that didn't bear any relevance to the interests of white working class Northerners. So this is the Jacksonian era. And in order to understand and try to remember what Jackson does as a president, it makes sense for us to back up and look at what he did as a during his let me adjust that there. As a young person, a bit of biography is necessary to understand what he does as president. This image in the background just recently, a statue of Jackson. It actually did not come down, but people tried to take it down in Washington. Spray painted killer. Indeed, if there was a president, you'd be hard pressed in terms of a president that killed more people. I think it states the obvious that Jackson was a killer. I mean, is personally responsible for killing people. He certainly, we know he killed at least one person in a duel. He himself was shot in a duel. He was a military leader. He was very hands-on as a military leader, in particular against the Creek and Seminole Indians. So it's suffice it to say that it's probably an understatement to call Andrew Jackson a killer. He indeed probably did kill many people. Okay, but enough about that. Let's go back in time to little baby Andrew Jackson, born in Waxhaw Settlement. This is on the North Carolina-South Carolina border. So it's interesting because Jackson is so associated with the West, quote-unquote West. Now, again, let's not project back from our sunny California perspective. When we say the West in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 1830s and 40s, we mean Mississippi, Kentucky. Obviously, that moves further and further west as the United States expands. But in Jackson's early part of his life, the West means those states. Okay, this is a community that he's born in that is under constant threat and attack by Native Americans. 1767 is a long time ago. right? If we're talking about Jackson's presidency, he becomes the president in 1828. So he's old. He's really old when he becomes the president. So he grows up in a community under constant native attack. Obviously, Native Americans in that region were not very thrilled about settler colonialism and English colonists taking their land and killing them. So it makes sense that they would fight back. This is also, however, while it's a border town right on the frontier, it is also connected to Charleston by a main road. And this is important because this gives a sense of Jackson's worldview. He is Western, but he's also very Southern. His malleable understanding of states' rights, his flexible understanding of executive power, his love for the military, for order, all of that is very Southern. So it makes sense to understand him as both a Westerner and a Southerner. So that is the first moment that is important in his life, is his upbringing. And we'll see as we go through, I'm going to show you 3 moments of his presidency, and you'll see why these 3 moments in his life are relevant to that. He served in the military in the War of 1812. Primarily, he's most famous for fighting in directing troops in the Battle of New Orleans, which actually happened after the treaty had been signed. The war had been over for some time. But, they didn't have, news updates on their phones. It took a while for the news to get to New Orleans, so they kept on fighting. He also led troops before he's president against the Creek Indians in the Creek War. That is before the War of 1812. And then after the War of 1812, he leads troops against the Seminole Indians in Florida. So you see from his upbringing and his military career that it is not a stretch to say that Andrew Jackson really hated Native Americans. It's certainly something that we would call racism. And even, indeed, racism is an understatement. It's almost a genocidal hatred towards Native Americans that really follows him throughout his military and presidential career. And then, obviously, the loss in 1824 to John Quincy Adams. He doesn't even really want to run. Again, he's old. He's retired. He's kind of cajoled into running in 1824 and loses in what we will know as the corrupt bargain, in which Henry Clay, through some backdoor dealings, throws his support behind John Quincy Adams, even though Jackson had more of the popular vote. It's a whole thing of goes to the House and they decide it. And Henry Clay, in order to get a cabinet position in the Adams administration, says he'll support Adams. Jackson is very pissed off about this. And boy, is he petty. The rest of his political career is dedicated to not only beating John Quincy Adams in the election of 1828, but also pushing back and resisting anything that has the stink of Whig or Federalist policy on it. So whether it's Henry Clay or John Quincy Adams or you name it, if it's a Whig thing or a Federalist thing, he ain't for it. So really petty. All right. So let's go back now. This is his background. Now let's go to his presidency. So Indian removal. So remember, if we look here, the first moment in his life is this kind of, his Southern upbringing and his hatred of Native Americans. This is his military career, his experience as a military man, not as a politician. And then this is his this is where he cuts his teeth, as it were, in politics, is a politics of what will be retribution. He wants to get back at the Whigs. So fast forward to his presidency. Indian removal begins in the 1830s. Again, his perspective is developed in Waxhaw County as a kid, in Nashville, which as he moves to Nashville, Tennessee later in life, it's also on the frontier. In his battle against the Seminoles in Florida, and the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and then the Trail of Tears of 1838 are the most prominent examples of things that happened during this time period. Now, Trail of Tears 1838, we know Jackson is elected in 1828, and he doesn't serve 10 years. He serves 8 years. So technically, the Trail of Tears happens under Martin Van Buren's presidency, who is elected after Jackson. But we still associate it with Jackson because he had such a strong hatred of Native Americans that even though it happens under Van Buren, it's initiated by Jackson. It behooves us to pause for a second and understand that I'm talking a lot about Native Americans and the genocide against Native Americans in this particular time period, but that this is not a new thing. From the Pequod massacre in the 1600s to the skirmishes between the settlers at Jamestown and the Algonquin Indians of Virginia, this has been an ongoing process of expropriation of native land, attack against Native Americans, and the genocide, indeed, against Native Americans. So let's not lose the forest for the trees, as it were, here. That it's particularly bad during this time period, but it's also bad in the 1870s in the West. It's bad in the 1860s in California. All of this is part of an ongoing policy of native removal. And settler colonialism. That's what settler colonialism is. It's not like, when people showed up to, St. Helena or some island in the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic and no one lived there. Part of settler colonialism is people live there already, and your policy is to take their land. And move them, force them off the land, force them into increasingly small, marginalized areas as you expand your settlement. So that's that. Trail of Tears, what is it? It's a 1,200-mile journey. 2,000 die in camps, and then 2,000 during the march itself. It is obviously a disaster, but this is a time period where the overwhelming majority of Americans did not they all hated Native Americans, right? It is very easy for us to look back and say, oh, well, I wouldn't have this, that, the other. But the majority of Americans, white Americans, were had very negative feelings towards Native Americans, very negative. So not a lot of people, obviously Native American leaders spoke out, but not a lot of white politicians or folks in general spoke out against this kind of stuff. There is a strange exception to that, and that is the John Marshall Court. John Marshall is still this in a 5-week summer class. This has less punch to it, but generally this is a couple months into the year. 3 months into the year, and people go, still John Marshall? Yes, it's still John Marshall. So the guy that in Marbury versus Madison in 1803 establishes judicial review is still sitting on the court in 1831 and rules in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia that the Cherokee Nation, Native Americans, are domestic dependent nations. So that is to say, they are a nation within a nation, effectively, right? That they are not some other place. They are within the United States. And they are dependent on the United States. But that doesn't really clear up the main question of are they sovereign or not? And in Worcester versus Georgia in 1832, the court rules that they are sovereign. That means that they have the right to self-governance. Even though they're within the United States and they're a domestic dependent nation, they have the right to self-governance. So it's effectively like, if a teenager lives with their parents and the parents supply them with things, pencils and food or water or whatever, that is a kind of domestic dependency. You live in their house. That's a domestic dependency. But this idea that teenager would be sovereign is a little different. That is to say that the Supreme Court would say, well, you can come and go as you please. You can, decorate your room however you want. You can do whatever you want, basically, for better or for worse. Your parents can't say anything about it. So effectively, that is the kind of it's a kind of preposterous example, but that's what this is. Domestic dependency says that they are with a nation within a nation, and then Worcester versus Georgia is a decision that says they are a sovereign nation. So the same as Canada or England or some other foreign country, they are sovereign. Andrew Jackson doesn't care. He says, I think famously says, or this is the story at least, Marshall has made his law, now let's see him enforce it. Basically, Supreme Court says you cannot remove people off of their land. Jackson says, I don't care, we're doing it anyway, and goes and does it anyway. So obviously we see here a moment in which Andrew Jackson does not have a great respect for the rule of law. Just doesn't care. Supreme Court opinion is supposed to be the law of the land. Jackson doesn't care if it doesn't go his way. Here's a map of the Trail of Tears. You see the 5 tribes, Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw up here. So here along the southern Appalachians in what is now Alabama, Georgia, and then here in what is now Mississippi, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. Seminole are down here in Florida. So those are the 5 tribes that are removed to Oklahoma. What will become Oklahoma, because eventually when settler colonialism pushes into this territory, their land is taken again. So the land that they are removed to is yet again taken by settler colonial policies. Okay. Keep in mind this map here, because I'm going to talk about land and land speculation, and it pays for us to remember that there was a time period where this was Native American land, and then they're all kicked off. And then what does that do in the wake of that? Okay, second moment in his life, or his presidency rather, is his, so again, to go back to the first slide here, right? This kind of fosters a hatred of Native Americans. This fosters a military style of rule. We see that in this idea that he doesn't care about the court saying you can't do something, he's going to do it anyway. And we see this also in various moments of his presidency. Nullification crisis is a big one. 1828, he's new into office. There is a tariff passed that South Carolina doesn't like. Citing the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and the which was in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, South Carolina says, we don't like this tariff. We're going to call it the tariff of abominations. It's going to hurt our economy. It's supposed to help the North. We're suspicious of what you're going to do with all this money. Why do you need all this money? The conspiracy theory in the South is that the North is creating these tariffs so they can generate revenue, so that they can effectively buy out all of the enslaved laborers in the South. So pay off the white enslavers for their lost property and eliminate slavery. So that's the conspiracy theory. So they cite nullification theory. Again, this idea that if the federal government does something you don't like, you can nullify. Andrew Jackson says, yeah, right. You ain't doing it. What's known as the Force Bill is passed, where he's going to send in troops to keep South Carolina in the Union. South Carolina backs down. So we see here a moment in which Andrew Jackson is as autocrat. He is a states' rights guy when it fits his personal opinion, and he is a strong federal power guy when it suits his personal opinion. You see what the kind of connecting line is here, is that if it serves Andrew Jackson, he's going to support it. So this happens here, very important nullification crisis, and the Force Bill and the Tariff of Abominations. South Carolina will get back at their old tricks again before the Civil War. This time we'll actually have a war fought. So this is an example of him citing federal unity over states' rights. I do not think this is a cartoon from the time period, but I always particularly like it because it reminds me of the old Kool-Aid ads where the Kool-Aid man busts through the wall. Nullification. Okay, and here's a meme. This is not one that I made, I believe. I think this is from Reddit probably, and a little old, but still relevant. Protective tariffs, South Carolina is not having it. Okay, so the third moment in Jackson's presidency, we remember here, moments in Jackson's life, and this is the third moment in his presidency. This loss in 1824 to John Quincy Adams really stings, and he makes it his political reason. The sole reason he stays in politics is to beat Adams. He does it, and then he does a bunch of petty stuff to hurt anything that is remotely Whig in nature. The first is the bank veto. Like the Federalists before them, the Whigs support a central bank. This is the second central bank of the United States. It's associated with Whigs. He doesn't like it. Henry Clay is a Whig. He doesn't like Henry Clay because Henry Clay is the architect of the corrupt bargain. So he withdraws the money from the national bank and redistributes it to local or pet banks. And boy, oh boy, is that do a number on the economy. The pet banks' lending policies are suspicious. They're not regulated at all. They lend money very, very easily. This is not necessarily good for the economy. It's good in the short run if you don't have money, but not good in the long run for the national economy. And it's one of the factors in the Panic of 1837 is this the fiscal policy of these pet banks. Again, maybe I'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but there's a spectrum from the gold standard to soft money or fiat currency. And if you have a lot of money, you want the gold standard, because if money is pegged to the gold standard, that is to say, like $100 equals X amount of actual gold. Right? And as long as there's no more gold, you only get more money. The government can only print more money as they acquire new gold. So that's not going to be a lot. So this is good if you have money because it helps to slow down inflation. That if you have $1,000 in 1830 and you're on the gold standard, your money is going to be worth more, definitely not less, in 1835, because there's not going to be inflation. The money is worth what the money is worth because it's tied to a specific amount of gold. And unless, gold starts falling from the heavens, that's not going to change that much, right? Now, the other side of that spectrum is soft or fiat currency, in which that's to say, just like you want more money, print more money. Just keep on cranking it out. And that'll help the government. If the government has to pay debts, just print the money and pay the debts with the printed money. Now, the problem here is this leads to inflation or hyperinflation. If the government is just printing money, that $1,000 in 1830 is not going to be worth the same amount of money in 1835 because, a loaf of bread will cost $1,000 in 1835 because everyone's going to be walking around with, pockets full of money because there's so much money in circulation. So that is a dumbed down kind of example. But basically, that's the distinction between a centralized national bank. They're going to be more kind to the gold standard, tougher on lending, versus these pet banks, which were giving money out pretty freely. This is a little overview is given in that cartoon about sectionalism, and we can talk more about this in class because it's really an important part of the economic history of the United States is this ongoing debate between gold standard, fiat or paper money currency, or the silver standard, which emerges in the 1860s. So I don't want to get mired down in it now. I actually have become mired down in it, but let's get ourselves out of it. Okay, other stuff. Marysville Road veto. Henry Clay wants this road built. It's all in the state of Kentucky. He ain't doing it. Doesn't like Henry Clay. He's petty. So you can't have money for your Marysville Road, Henry Clay. He is, again, a strong executive. This is important because between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, we will learn that there is a series of rather weak executives, weak presidents. They don't do much. They kind of punt when it comes to putting their foot down on sectional problems, which leads to Congress getting involved and kicking the can down the road, putting it off until the issue at hand about slavery and the extension of slavery into the Western territories becomes one they have to confront. Lincoln runs on the idea of confronting it, and we have a civil war. So obviously, when South Carolina says it's going to leave the Union in the 1830s, Jackson puts his foot down, and South Carolina stays in line for a while until 1860, when they do it again, and a bunch of Southern states join them. But more on that later. Specie circular and the Panic of 1837. This has to do with the issuance of currency or soft money. This also has to do with rampant land speculation. Again, as I mentioned in either a lecture in class or at some point previously, the Panic of 1819 also has to do with land speculation. That is to say, people buying land, assuming that it's going to, when they plant crops on that land, it's going to generate a certain amount of revenue. Revenue to cover the price of the land, revenue to cover your living expenses, and then revenue to make a profit. Now, you have to assume, you got to do the math on it, right? And say like, okay, wheat is worth, $100 a bushel. If I have, I'm not going to be able to do the math here on the top of my head. Even if I had a pen and paper, I couldn't do the math. But if I, do the math, beep, beep, boop, boop, and I buy X amount of acres of land at $100 a bushel, and I can grow this many bushels per acre, beep, beep, boop, boop, you think about how much money you're going to make, and you go, okay, I'm going to buy all this land. Now, the assumption is that wheat price is going to be at $100 or more per bushel. When a bunch of people start doing that, this is how economics works. When there's not just me, but 100 or 1,000 people doing the same thing, and they're all producing wheat, well, lo and behold, the price of wheat goes down, and everyone suffers because we can't get that money, and we all go bankrupt. This happens big time in the 1830s. Why? Because of all of this land, right? This is land that was previously occupied by Native Americans. It's flooded by settlers and speculators. They buy plots of land, they resell it, they move the prices up. People move in thinking they're going to get rich quick, or at least in a 12-month agricultural cycle, and it doesn't pan out, and it's another one of the factors leading to the crash, the Panic of 1837. The spoils system, this is something we associate with Jackson as well, but it is ongoing. The spoils system was a system in which if I'm running for president, I promise I'll get you a job or a position in my government. If you can promise me you're going to get me X amount of votes. And when I become president, you come and you get your job, and that's how I stay in power, is I keep people who can get me those votes close to me. It's corruption, but this is a time period where they do not have the secret ballot yet. So if it's some person that can deliver votes, they know they can deliver votes because they can see the people voting with like a green or red ballot. They know that that's a vote for their person. So spoil system. And then, of course, as I said at the outset, the expanded franchise, taking away property requirements for people to vote. This is, again, it becomes national under Andrew Jackson, but actually it is something that is initially, or it's initiated by Western states, Illinois, Mississippi, Alabama. These states actually take away property requirements first because they need settlers. And they know if they take away property requirements, and then poor people from back east will move to their states because they know they can vote, and then they'll have more people, which means more representation in Congress and more revenue, etc., etc. It becomes national under Andrew Jackson. This is an example of a kind of the radical potential of equal opportunity as outlined in the Declaration of Independence. Right? A lot of wealthy industrialists in Boston, in New York, in Hartford, would have resisted this because they said this is actually infringing on our constitutional rights. Part of our constitutional rights as a property owner is to have protection of property. And if all of these poor laborers are suddenly leaving the city, then we're not going to be able to supply cheap labor to our factories. And we think this is a violation of our rights. However, the other side of the coin here is the rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence, and these are the more radical rights. Now, again, women not included, Black Americans, both free and enslaved, not included, Native Americans obviously not included. This is not an expansion of the franchise that is universal by any means. But it is a very important expansion of the franchise, and that it takes away these property requirements. In closing, Andrew Jackson is in the time period at least, is a rather polarizing figure. If you're a poor Democrat, newly arrived immigrant, you love him. He gave you the right to vote. He doesn't care about Native Americans, neither do you. That's your guy. That's your kind of like almost like Washington on horseback, right? Military general, strong leader, doesn't give a hoot about John Marshall and all this fuddy-duddy rule of law stuff. If he wants to do it, he does it. Rules or no rules. So some people like that. Some people like that kind of authoritarian kind of leader. They like to get in line behind an authoritarian like that. And that's what happened in this time period. A lot of Democratic Republican voters are very eager to line up behind the leadership of a general, of an authoritarian. On the other hand, is this view of Andrew Jackson as a tyrant, as a monarch, as someone who is, destroying the Constitution and all this. We'll analyze this image a little bit more in class because it's one you frequently see on DBQs and stuff, and it's also a very rich document to analyze. But at the time period, he's a very polarizing figure. Again, quote unquote, he's still polarizing now, but the facts of the matter, we can have a political debate if you want, but in terms of the actual facts of the matter, as I said at the outset, he killed people. He had a genocidal hatred of Native Americans. When the dust settles, the record doesn't look great for Andrew Jackson, but that's historical fact. Political debate and discussion, I suppose, is another one. You got to entertain opinions of all stripes. But in terms of the actual facts on the ground, not much going on. He's a guy who's president. I guess that's something you need to respect. But anyway, that two sides of Andrew Jackson, that is the Jacksonian period, that is Jacksonian democracy, the expansion of the franchise, all the stuff he did, petty president Andrew Jackson. But certainly a guy that if you were alive in that time period, you would not like him, but you'd want him to like you. He's that kind of bad guy. So that's all for now. Thank you very much. And the end.